Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
All right, on this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast, I reconnect with David Pudwill. David is Mr. Regulatory, and we talk about PMA, or Premarket Approval. This is a FDA regulatory pathway for Class 3 products, or well, I guess generally speaking, Class 3 products. But anyway, I hope you enjoy some of the details and information that David shares with us about PMA. Hello, and welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host and founder, Green Guru, Jon Speer. PMAs, I was actually talking to a colleague earlier today. We were talking about innovation and that sort of thing. And we briefly talked about, sort of the pros and cons and briefly dabbled in or discussed PMA. But the good news is joining me today is David Pudwill. David is also known as Mr. Regulatory. Check him out, mrregulatory.com. But David, welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast.
Hey, thank you. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. And I guess I'll bring the discussion I was having with a colleague and bounce it off you and get your insights. But I've been in this industry long enough, and I suspect what I'm about to share is probably even relatively common point of view even today in 2021. But I remember many years ago, we would work on a project, we would figure out sort of that regulatory pathway and that sort of thing. And the moment we would come back and say it's Class 3 PMA, FDA, all the executives threw their hands up in the air like, kill it, we can't do that. So anyway, I guess
I think that's typical.
Yeah. But, why do you think that is?
So I think some of it is just the time frame, in question, as well as the fact that just a lot of us in the industry, I'd say as companies at least, if we were to try to take on a PMA product within our existing quality system, it would probably be chancy to say the least. I mean, maybe you could speak a little bit more to that from the sort of the quality side of things. And in discussions, that have been had, around this topic, I've heard things even floated about and heard that people have done this where they've actually spun up an entirely new entity to manage, a higher classification product to sort of handle these exact kinds of issues. So I think that might be part of it, is just the complications of how do we manage that. But there's a fear, I think, of what FDA is going to, what challenges FDA is going to present, or there's the uncertainty about the clinical study outcomes, or whether this is really going to successfully meet the unmet need well enough to do well in the market. There's so many questions and challenges, and regulatory is definitely a big piece of that in terms of what that higher classification does for you.
Yeah, and that was sort of the nature of the discussion that I was having with my colleague is, especially for, if you're an early stage company, I mean, you've got a finite amount of capital. You want, as best as you can, some predictability or at least some level of certainty. And, if there is such a thing in the regulatory world, I mean, 510K is the most predictable. And I'm not trying to imply that it is predictable, but it's way more predictable than de novo or PMA. So I suspect that that's probably some of the rationale there, not the least of which the capital that is required and the skill set and the knowledge and expertise and the time that it takes. Generally speaking, a PMA is going to be more expensive and longer to get to market, right?
Especially, and some of this it's not necessarily a question of PMA versus not PMA for what the real time drivers are. It's definitely a consideration, but let's say that you had let's say FDA was going to be willing to accept a product as a de novo. Sort of implied in that is that it would be a smaller study or a less long, study in terms of, duration of follow-up and all of these details potentially. But the real driver is going to be around the clinical questions and the IDE study considerations, which are all interconnected with device classification to some degree. But if you have to do the same study for a 510K product versus a PMA product, the difference in time to market is, let's call it, I mean, it might be 6 months, it might be a year, sort of worst case scenario if things sort of go to plan. But it could be approximately the same, depending on how long it takes you to respond to questions, or if there are questions. Because for a PMA, you've got a review window. It's long. It's significantly longer than a 510K. But most of the things that are going to be drivers for the time to when you can even submit your device for FDA review are going to be in getting adequate clinical follow-up. And usually you need more than 1 year's worth of data on a significant number of subjects to get to that point.
Yeah.
So,
and I think they kind of that's an example or an element of what you were hinting at a moment ago, as far as, companies being equipped from a, quality system or just systems in general to be able to accommodate and manage the PMA process. That is an example. I think where a lot of companies don't necessarily have that skill set or those systems set up to be able to do that effectively.
And there are a lot of interdependencies, and one of those is really, and I think that the key thing for me that's a concern when you're talking about product classification is really around reimbursement, and whether you have an existing reimbursement pathway or whether you're going to have to forge your own path. Because we've definitely seen situations in the past where you come up with this novel product and you move forward with it. I've seen other people do this. And then you get to CMS and you present this to them, and they give you a reimbursement pathway that kills your product, because it's not going to net in terms of reimbursement a sufficiently high reimbursement to cover the cost of manufacturing and distributing that product. So that can also be a killer for a product that would otherwise be innovative. It can get on the market, even at, let's say, lower classifications. And that might be more typical at lower classifications because you already have a defined reimbursement usually already set up there.
And speaking of the topic of reimbursement, I recently did an episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast with Mike Drews, where we actually talked about that very topic. So I would encourage folks to go listen to that. But, for the sake of this episode, let's dive into that a little bit further, because I think the layperson doesn't think a lot about reimbursement.
Yep.
If they do, I think they think, oh, well, they're both part of HHS, and these two branches of HHS, they're talking to each other. So what do I need to do? I mean, but it's just not the case.
Well, I would say it's improved, but I don't think it's where the medical device industry would like to see it in terms of a collaboration between at least CMS and FDA. FDA is also open to engagement with other payers, and with payers directly. I mean, you could have different kinds of entities come and meet with FDA to talk about broader issues, and FDA has gone out of their way to try to engage with certain large payers, and they're aware of this as an issue. But even with that awareness, I don't know that the landscape is yet where it really needs to be. I've heard, when I was at FDA, I heard some venture capitalists that were invited in to sort of share with us that perspective, so that we would have an appreciation of interactions with small startups, at least, and some of the challenges that they face. And it is something that FDA has gone out of their way to make the review staff aware of. It's also something where, as a member of the review staff when I was at FDA, being aware of that, it opened the door a little bit for, not that you would accept a lower bar of evidence, but that you would oftentimes move more, especially with a small startup and even with other companies, towards offering different avenues to resolve a question. Because at FDA, one of the key things is they don't necessarily have a good sense of how much things cost. So if they tell you, hey, we would suggest you go do this thing, which for us to review, let's say if I was at FDA, would be easier for me, there are maybe a couple other things that could be acceptable, and you can go off and figure that out on your own. But it sometimes helps for FDA to say, hey, here are a couple options. We're open to you proposing something else. Just even saying that we're open to this, we're open to something else, is enough to sometimes solicit that from a company. Whereas otherwise, if FDA suggests something, the company says, oh, that's what we have to do. And oh, by the way, it's going to cost a small fortune. And there's this other thing that would make more sense, we think, but we're not going to tell FDA that we should do this other thing that FDA might not even be aware of as an option to address their question.
For sure. All right. So let's steer the ship back a little bit more towards PMA sorts of things. I mean, it's all related, folks, but one of the things that I think is important is, regulatory strategy. And this, I think, is the case regardless of what the pathway, outcome is determined to be. But, if I have an eye, I mean, there's an advantage to me being a PMA from a product perspective because of uniqueness and innovative and things of that nature and things that I can claim. Of course, I need to have the evidence to support that. But as we've already hinted at, that could be a more costly, a longer path to get there. So do you have any tips or pointers for companies that may have their eye on that PMA prize, but want to make sure they don't run out of cash in time?
On the way. Well, one of the considerations there too is I'll get into that in just a second. It's useful to think about this in terms of what the long-term benefit is of the regulatory strategy you pick and what options you have, because within the PMA framework, it does mean that if somebody's going to directly compete against you for that set of claims and this particular type of a product, they're going to have to show a similar level of evidence because of the way FDA typically is going to view things from a level playing field kind of a standpoint. And their expectations for what you would present sort of sets the stage for what other people would present. And that's true to some degree as well with, let's say, a de novo. So it's helpful to be the first through the gate, even for one of these kinds of products where it's a class 2 device, but it's going to be still reasonably costly to get the de novo in. And then the next submitter is going to have a defined path, and it's going to be an easier sort of journey for them to take to get a 510K found substantially equivalent to your de novo product, versus if you follow the PMA path, now somebody else has to follow the PMA path to get to where you are. But a typical strategy from a regulatory standpoint is to try to figure out, if you have a product, how can it be used in non-medical ways or in lower classification, of risk ways within, a medical context even. And a couple examples. One, I would say, so physical medicine products, so exercise equipment effectively, can fall into this category of a non-medical kind of a product. And depending on what kind of claims and how you're using this same kind of equipment, it can then fall into the category of a regulated medical device. And then on the sort of higher risk classification side of things, you have a really good example in the area of biliary stents. So these are the same design, oftentimes for use in a context where it's for palliative care. It's a lower risk kind of consideration. And FDA's standard in terms of the bar is set at a 510K level, versus the exact same product used in a vascular context is a PMA a product. So you might even have the exact same device that you're designing for a vascular application and say, oh, there's a way to actually generate some revenue as a biliary stent in palliative care with a different set of labeling, which is restrictive because FDA is aware of the fact that you have some products that are identical. And so they saw this growth in this area of biliary stents, and they said, what's going on here? And, come to find out there's, maybe some people using products off label. So FDA has strictly labeled these products, but it gives you an avenue where if this technology can be used in a slightly different context, or if your development journey in terms of the product, maybe you have an iteration of the product that can get to market in a slightly different context, and you can start generating revenue, with say a 510K or a non-medical device, product on your way to something. It also maybe allows you to develop more information. do more robust testing, and it depending on how you set it up, it could really help you out in your journey to, let's say, even a PMA product.
Oh, for sure. I mean, and I think the biliary stent example is a classic. It reminds me of a time in my past. I think once upon a time there were probably more biliary stents cleared, 510K cleared stents on the market than there might have been biliary procedures.
Yes, that was definitely what tipped off FDA, and they had a come to Jesus meeting. Maybe there's another way to frame that, but the FDA was not pleased. This predated my time at FDA, but I actually worked in the group.
This was back early 2000s. Yeah, I mean the stent race was interesting, and that's a whole topic for a different day anyway. But nonetheless, I think the point here is that as you're exploring like your ultimate strategy from your product and from a regulatory perspective, there may be some branches or offshoots, if you will, along the way that will allow you to introduce your product with a 510K or a quote simpler regulatory submission that it may limit what you claim your product does for that clearance, but it might give you an opportunity to introduce that product into the market, generate revenue, and you might be able to help fund that future use case and that PMA indications. I think it's smart, for a lot of companies to do this. And to your point, I mean, there's lots of advantages of a PMA. I mean, it's sort of the regulatory equivalent of having a patent, so to speak. It's a little different, but there's some real intrinsic values.
Protections.
Yeah, some protections for sure. So I guess maybe talk a little bit about getting into some of the details and some of the logistics. But when technically does a product require a PMA from an FDA perspective?
Yeah, so FDA has written a fair amount on this, and it's really going to come down to historical precedent. So it's not quite it depends, but it's one of those kinds of answers. It depends on what was on the market in the pre-amendments timeframe versus and how FDA classified that, and that goes back to the 70s. So it's sort of an interesting way of viewing the world is pick a date in time, sometime in the 70s, and anything before that is pre-amendments, and everything post that is sort of new. And the original way that FDA thought about, or I should say Congress thought about this, was they intended for new products coming to market to be PMA products. And the only reason that you would follow this like 510K pathway would be that you're making a minor change to an existing product. And they, at the time, sort of expected things to move into this, pre-market, approval space. But the 510K program evolved, and the PMA program became something a little bit different. And you got to this point where now we have this very robust, active 510K program, which was expected to be, I think, a sliver of what was happening. And the PMA program is, maybe the size of what was expected to be the 510K program if you go all the way back, to when the medical device, amendments were written.
Can I chime in on that for a moment? Because just an interesting tidbit, and I can probably, if I think about it long enough, I'll jog the memory cell. But I was at an event once where I was sitting or having lunch next to the guy who actually wrote the 510K provision. I think he said it was part of the Carter administration, and he said it was always only intended to be a temporary provision. And here we are, many, many years later, almost my entire life later, and it's to your point, it's the more common route, and way more so than some of the others. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting tidbit. Is like it was never intended to be a long-term thing, but here we are.
Well, as my as a former civil servant, and as my uncle who was in government in military for a number of years would say, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. So, just to bring a little levity to it. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that 510K is the more robust, of the pathways in terms of the number of submissions and all this. But that aside, I mean, so with PMAs, really the idea is that this is, anything new. And What that means now is something different, let's say, in context than what it was, originally. But it's something like, 30 to 40, submissions on average, a year, something in that ballpark. I should actually probably go look up the current year figures. I should have had that on hand. But the idea here is that you don't fall into, you're not substantially equivalent, you're not similar enough to any product that's currently on the market, or you are similar to a product that is a PMA. So if there is a PMA product, and this is a common misconception, I think, amongst some people when they're just getting into regulatory is, oh, well, there are PMA products, and then at some point somebody submits a 510K to be substantially equivalent to a PMA. It's like, no, that's not how it works. Now, it's possible for PMAs to get down classified. It's possible for HDEs in the same kind of way to get down classified, and then you could have a 510K found substantially equivalent to that category of products. But once a PMA, unless it's down classified, it's going to remain a PMA pathway for future devices that are coming to market. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And FDA writes that PMA devices often involve new concepts, and many are not of a type marketed prior to the medical device amendments. Therefore, they do not have a classification regulation in the CFR, and that's where you're going to find your substantial equivalence comparisons to existing products. In this case, the product classification database will only cite the device type name and product code. And so, that's going to be for your PMA type devices, these new concept, think new. And it's going to vary a little bit from what you may consider new versus what, from a regulatory precedent standpoint, FDA is going to consider new. And some of that could be a change in indications. So if you use the same device in a different context, like the biliary stent case, if you use the exact same product in a slightly different way, you can totally change the classification and how FDA views that product.
All right, folks, I want to take a brief pause and remind you all I'm talking with David Pudwill. David also goes by the moniker Mr. Regulatory. You can check out his website by going to mrregulatory.com, MR Regulatory, all one word, no spaces, hyphens, or anything of that nature.com. David also has a growing library of content on YouTube, some really great videos about some of the different regulatory nuances, from an FDA perspective, really good stuff. So go to YouTube, just search for Mr. Regulatory and subscribe to his channel. And be sure you click the little notification thing so you get alerted of when the new stuff comes out. But I also want to remind you too that, Greenlight Guru, we have the only medical device quality management system software platform available today in the marketplace. It's designed specifically and exclusively for medical device companies, and it's been designed by actual medical device professionals. So whether you're pursuing a 510K, a de novo, or PMA, we have workflows within the Greenlight Guru medical device quality management system software to help you navigate that process. So if you'd like to learn more, go to www.greenlight.guru, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you to understand your needs, your requirements, your timelines, and hopefully we have some products and services that can help you out along the way. So, David, let's get back into the conversation. Talk a little bit about maybe timeline if I do go down this PMA path, and maybe some typical or recommended steps that I might consider along that way.
In terms of classification, you're really going to be looking at risk for the product, and you're going to be looking at the 510K database for existing products that are out there. You're going to take a look at maybe if there are existing PMA products out there where the risks have already been defined. If you can't find a product like yours, then you're going to be pulling together information consistent, and you could potentially pull together a summary of safety and effectiveness for the product. Let's say you could mock that up for where you're headed. FDA has a template that you can take a look at. You can look at what some products on the market already have pulled together in terms of their summaries of safety and effectiveness. And the idea is you can take a look at, in this context, post-study based on real-world evidence, based on the observed adverse events, how the product effectiveness in terms of meeting a defined medical goal in terms of treatment of a condition, or whatever the indication happens to be in terms of that effectiveness criteria, whether you meet that in comparison to the safety profile. And you can get a pretty good sense, I'd say, even without hard evidence, a priori of about where your product is going to fall. And some of that is the product implanted? And this is one of the things that FDA, will bring up. I mean, it's some sort of high level, considerations. What's the duration of use? I mean, if you're talking about a shorter duration of use product, you're probably talking about lower classification. Not always, but probably. Is it going to be implanted? Is it intended to be implanted permanently? How long are we talking? Does the product resorb? That might actually, change the risk classification such that a product that, let's say, a biliary stent that's non-resorbable, for palliative use, if you make a device that's resorbable for non-palliative use, which is a really small, context for, let's say, non-vascular, stents like that, where you're treating some benign condition, and maybe you want the stent to resorb. That might change your classification in ways that actually up-classify the product, even though the reason you've made that modification or you're trying to develop that kind of a product is to improve the user outcomes. So these are some of the things to be thinking about. Biocompatibility is always going to be an issue. Human factors is becoming more and more a consideration. What's happening in terms of either the clinician or the patient and their interface with the device? Do they have some user interface that they're manipulating? Is the product electrical? Is it passive? These are all going to play into your considerations. And don't you have some tools as part of the Greenlight Guru to address some of these kinds of things and map some of that out?
There are some workflows that can help navigate that process for sure. I think the other thing that I'm hearing is that, as you're describing this, is PMA type of products. They often represent more uncertainty as far as the path forward. And I'm a huge fan of a pre-sub for a lot of cases, but it seems to me that this is a no-brainer opportunity for pre-sub. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, in terms of how you want to move forward with sort of a typical timeline. Let's say if you think you've got a PMA style product, or even if you're not sure, definitely FDA's got a very robust pre-submission program set up. And my advice in some of your previous podcasts has definitely been to go ahead and avail yourself of that process. And so first and foremost, get in front of FDA. And my advice to people would generally be to find an image, find something that is a visual cue that people can latch onto. Sometimes company names and logos change, but if you can get a diagram somehow of either the product itself or how it's used, or some kind of a workflow that you think is going to remain consistent throughout the life cycle of the product. I've seen some companies do that really well. It really helps the reviewer to key into, for sure, and be able to sort of trigger them, because they might see 100 submissions in a year, and so the faster they're going to get back up to speed, and if they were involved, remember, oh, this is that product, the better off you're going to be as a company, because this process, as we discussed earlier, is going to take probably a couple of years between that initial, let's say, pre-submission interaction with FDA, some interactions probably within an investigational device, exemption or IDE study. I don't know, I can't prejudge whether that's going to strictly be required. And again, that's one of the reasons you'd have a discussion with FDA.
Absolutely.
Is, maybe you have an initial interaction with FDA as you're developing this, and you're talking with them about your thinking and doing some pre-clinical kinds of assessments in advance of even thinking about an IDE study, or whether you would need one, doing some bench testing and animal testing on the product. And then maybe you interact with FDA again in another pre-submission before submitting an investigational device exemption study, if you do one, and probably in a PMA context you would. And then you're going to get to a point where you end up with some kind of a pre-PMA meeting once the study results are looking like you can pull everything together into a PMA submission. Be careful about not unblinding your study and confounding your statistics. I would say in terms of your interactions with FDA. But this is the path you generally follow to get to the place of being able to then decide on whether you submit a PMA. And then you've got a couple options in front of you, which are you've got a traditional PMA format that I would say FDA would generally suggest. There's a modular PMA format, which you'd have to agree with FDA on how you're submitting different sections within the PMA. And that can sometimes help accelerate review of at least certain subparts of the PMA, so that maybe there's less for FDA to review at the end. But FDA's experience with this is generally that the modular PMAs, there's always going to be some set of modules that get rolled in to the to that final module submission to FDA, where for whatever reason either you were delayed in your submissions of the modules, or you were ahead of schedule in terms of having everything finally prepared to then get into FDA. It is usually that some of the modules were delayed, in my experience at least.
And if I recall too, it's been a day or two since I've looked at the latest on this, but I don't think everything that's a PMA type product would necessarily qualify for the modular PMA approach too. But do you happen to know? I mean, I can't remember.
You're going to have an agreement with FDA on that. And so, there are some types of submissions that FDA is going to dissuade you from. And I would say, based on what my discussions have been with FDA leadership in recent history, they're generally going to be dissuading people from doing modular PMAs. And PDPs are something that used to be bigger. You might see a couple of them occasionally. These product development process where you would have a preset of agreements with FDA on this whole pre-market submission, but they've mostly fallen out of favor. I don't know that they were ever a really big component of the PMA program in anything that I've seen. Though you'll occasionally see a PDP in terms of some of the historical PMA applications that have been approved. And with there's a lot of guidance around modular PMAs. Just to jump back to that, and there's what's called a shell that gets submitted, and that's sort of the high level, and then you have these modules within, and you have a planned time frame for when you submit, and so FDA can see as this is coming. And FDA specifically says this method is not appropriate when the applicant is very close to being ready to submit a PMA, or when the device design is in a state of flux or likely to change. So that's going to be the key issue for you, is if you're looking for more flexibility, which FDA has built into some other programs in terms of breakthrough devices and things like that. If you're looking for the ability to do device modifications as you progress, you're not going to want to do a modular PMA. For
sure. I guess kind of thinking, forward. So like I have, this submission and a traditional, let's just assume for the moment it's a traditional PMA. I've concluded my IDE. I've got my results, my data. I've done my statistical analysis and all those sorts of things. I get the audience with FDA. part of that process, if memory serves correct too, there will be an on-site inspection by FDA, typically for PMA too, right?
Yeah. So and that's going to be sort of on the back end, and that'll determine potentially, how FDA or what FDA's final decision is on the PMA. So if you've got an approvable, PMA and you're waiting for a final inspection, another thing to consider is you might end up with a panel meeting. That's another one of the considerations. It depends on the PMA type. Or the device type, I should say, and whether FDA believes that they need expert input into their review process. But oftentimes there will be a panel meeting, and that'll increase the duration as well of how long FDA has to review a device, which makes it more likely that you would have had an inspection sort of scheduled and
right.
And done. So it's sort of one of these mixed bags where, yes, the timeline is longer, but maybe you sort of get to the same place in the end, in terms of, getting all the dominoes lined up so that you can get your product on the market.
One of the other things I think is important to consider is the user fees that are associated with a PMA, because, they're not trivial, but maybe remind us all of what those are these days. And I don't. Order of magnitude's fine. I know sometimes that changes a little bit.
And I'll tell you. So so some of this is going to be. So what we've been talking about so far is the original, the original PMA, application. Okay, and so for a panel track supplement, let's say for a PMA, we're talking about let's round up $275,000 in fiscal year 2021 under the MDUFA user fee, or I'm sorry, that's for the panel track supplement. That's for a modification. For the original, it's $366,000. So for a PMA, a PDP, a modular PMA, a BLA, you're talking about north of $350,000 just for the standard fee. Now, if you're a small business, then that's going to be lower by
usually it's about half, if I recall right.
It's significantly it's about a fourth. It's about a fourth for those fees actually. But so you're still talking about close to $100,000 even for the small business fees. Then for supplements, I mean, that's where some of the money really gets involved, I guess I should say. So you've got the original. If it's your first, original PMA, those have been waived for the first submission. Some of those fees in the past. I'm not seeing any specific guidance on that, so don't hold me to it. But I know in the past for your first PMA it was free, but it's like a dealer. Now all of your supplements are going to cost you a small fortune. So
and I guess just to clarify, a supplement. So I've got this. Yeah. I've received PMA approval from FDA. But now, for whatever reason, there's a need to make a change or an update to that. That's handled through another submission to the FDA called a PMA supplement. So this is where, not that they're out to get you, but this is where maybe that caveat is important to specify.
Yeah, and that's the real difference in terms of, I would say, the classification, where with a 510K, if you make certain changes, yes, you're going to have to come in with a new 510K. But we're talking about right now in 2021, $12,000, $13,000 for a new 510K. Generally faster, review time frame. It doesn't consider, manufacturing. For the PMA, if you're going to make a manufacturing change, you're now talking about, 30-day notices. Now, those are somewhat cheaper. You're still talking about $6,000 for a 30-day notice, for a manufacturing change. and for your annual report. So every year, it's also going to cost you $13,000, and expect that cost to go up year over year. So you get some more regular costs to maintain a higher classification product. But most of the costs of maintaining your product on the market probably isn't in the submission fees themselves. It's in everything else around it. It's in maintaining your system. It's in having the staff on who knows what they're doing, such that you can do the submissions and maintain all of this and do the testing. But the original fees and the panel track supplements, if you have a panel track supplement, it would be a more significant device change. Those are going to cost you a bit more. So for the original, it's like I said, $366,000 in fiscal year 2021, and for a panel track supplement, you're talking about $275,000, and then for 180-day supplements, you're talking about $55,000, and for a real-time supplement, which is a more narrow set of changes, you're still talking about $26,000. So significant, orders of magnitude higher in general than 510K costs, just from a regulatory submission standpoint.
Yeah, and I'll throw in I think a plug here. This is one of the things that the FDA Case for Quality initiative. This wasn't their original mission per se, but I think this is one of the things that was discovered in some of the previous years of the pilot program, Case for Quality pilot program, was the regulatory landscape, I guess is probably a nice way to say it, with respect to PMA products and specifically things like supplements and things like that. So I know that the Case for Quality initiative has been very focused on identifying opportunities to remove some of the obstacles and barriers and burdens to that process in the spirit of ensuring that products are getting the improvements that they need to improve their quality and safety and effectiveness and that sort of thing. So, for folks that might be in the space, I would encourage you to explore that Case for Quality program, because there's some really, as far as regulatory is concerned, I think innovative, if I can use such a word, when talking about regulatory, some innovative approaches that being a part of that Case for Quality initiative might afford you that might not be an option for you otherwise. But I guess, David, to kind of put a wrapper on today's conversation on PMA, that's
a 10-year anniversary, by the way, coming up later this year on that Case.
I know, it's hard to believe that it's been around that long, but but to kind of put a wrapper on the PMA conversation today, any key tips, pointers, takeaways that you think are really important for folks?
Yeah, the key thing again is really to be thinking with the end in mind of where you want to get to. Definitely there are opportunities to get products developed in a way where maybe there's a different context of use that you can get some experience with that technology or with the product earlier on in a slightly different use setting, whether that's a different medical device a type or classification, or whether that's a non-medical device application. And then the other thing is there are a couple good videos that are out there just on my channel talking about PMAs. If you do have the pleasure of putting together a PMA, I walk through the filing reviews and the acceptance reviews for 510K. So just what all to make sure that is included so that your PMA application would be accepted. And, also talk a little bit about supplements during COVID. So for anybody affected, in this, period of the pandemic, FDA's put out some guidance around that as well, earlier last year. And, one last thing is, there's a little walkthrough I did as well for one particular PMA product, and it gives a good overview of how to look at PMA information that's already there in the database, and what to be looking at for approval orders and summary of safety and effectiveness and labeling and some clinical trial and post-approval study information, that kind of thing. So I've got a couple videos out there. Other people have good resources. There's a lot of really great content on the FDA website to help walk you through the process. And, it's never too early to make sure that you have a robust quality system in place is going to be my last shout out for all the good work that you guys are doing over there at Greenlight Guru.
Well, I appreciate the segue. Folks, we'll curate some of those links that David mentioned and include those with the show notes. But absolutely, quality system, regardless of frankly, of your device pathway, whether you're class 1, 2, 3, FDA, EU, Canada, you're going to need a quality management system to articulate and describe how you do business and how you've digested those important medical device regulations that are applicable to your business into your day-to-day operations. And we've got you covered. This is what we do for a living at Greenlight Guru. We provide companies with a platform. We have other products and services that can help you establish that quality management system. So I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about how we might be able to help, go to www.greenlight.guru. And again, we'd be happy to have a conversation, understand your needs, your markets, your pathways, and all those sorts of things. We've got a team of gurus and experts ready to help you out in addition to our platform. As always, I want to thank my guest, David Pudwill, Mr. Regulatory. David, thank you so much for the insights on PMA.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. And as always, this is your host and founder at Greenlight Guru, Jon Speer, and you have been listening to the Global Medical Device Podcast.